James Madison was a 67-year-old carpenter from Old Meadows, Idaho. He was known to be an experienced hunter, and on September 11th of 1952, he left for the Nez Perce National Forest with his friend Claude Buffalo. The two hiked to a very secluded location known as 14 Mile Tree. The aptly named place is about 14 miles east of the Red River Ranger Station. Here they were planning to set up camp and wait a few days for the start of the deer season. A newspaper described the spot as one of the most isolated in north-central Idaho. During their stay, James decided to take a bucket and search for a nearby river where they could retrieve some water. He left on his own without his rifle and never returned. Claude would spend the rest of the day and the night searching for his friend, but found nothing. The next day, he traveled to the Red River Ranger Station and informed park officials of the incident. Soon after, the local sheriff became involved and the search for James was on. Up to 100 men were involved in the daily searches, including bloodhounds and an experienced tracker from Montana. While the dogs initially caught some fresh scents, they would only encounter dead ends. Two of James' sons became involved in the rescue, and airmen from a nearby military survival school lended their assistance by searching from the air. Still, nothing was found, and the days would keep dragging on with no success and no clues. 2 weeks into the search, it was reported that a body had been found in the Salmon River, a location nearly 15 miles from the camp that James disappeared from. The body was discovered by a wilderness area hunter and his friends, who lived deep in the Idaho primitive country. James' two sons confirmed the identity of their father's body. A mortician showed up on scene and reported that the body was found in about 1.5 feet of water. He determined that the death was caused by exhaustion instead of drowning, and that James had likely only perished 3 or 4 days prior to being found. Most of James' clothes were missing, and his shoes were gone. Of particular note was the fact that he had apparently walked so hard and so far that he had worn the soles of his feet to the bone. His body was then taken out of the area on horseback and handed over to his sons for burial. How or why James disappeared is unknown. Perhaps he was unsure of where to find water in the area and simply got lost. It is clear, however, that the strangest part of his story is the unclothed state he was found in, as well as the fact that he took his shoes off and was physically able to walk until his feet were worn to the bone. Most people would give up long before anything like this would happen. It also makes you question what state of mind he must have been in to do this. While it can be quite common to hear of a missing person being found without their shoes, it is entirely uncommon to hear of one who was able to walk until the soles of their feet were gone. I would also like to point out that this important detail is only mentioned in one newspaper out of at least a dozen that I was able to find. Whether this was because most reporters were not aware of this fact, or there was a deliberate attempt to downplay it, is unknown. Initially, I wondered if this injury may have been a result of decomposition or animal predation, but there were no other reported wounds on James's body. If we trust in the word of the mortician who examined him, the disappearance of James Madison certainly ranks among the most bizarre you will ever hear about. August Kleist was 42 years old. He was a wealthy businessman from Pontiac, Michigan, who owned a movie theater chain and a bus line. He had recently returned from a trip to Florida and was attempting to reach the Elks hunting camp. This was a cabin in the wilderness located 7 miles south of Creighton, Michigan, where a number of August's friends were already staying. In a town called Hiawatha, he asked for directions to Creighton and then set out on foot. He was wearing thin clothing and only carried a small pack with him. Soon after, he would return to Hiawatha, soaking wet after apparently getting lost. A local advised him to take a train to Creighton, which he did. After arriving, he headed into the wilderness once more, only to appear back in town the next day after having spent a hard night lost in the wilderness. August was once again given explicit directions on how to reach the hunting camp, and soon after he headed into the forest, but this try would be his last. Some hunters at the time reportedly witnessed August going in the completely wrong direction from what he had been told. These incidents of August Kleist, seemingly unable to follow directions, led newspapers to describe him as being an unsettled mind or mentally unbalanced. August unwittingly walked into an area of dense poplar swamps and would not return. His friends would report that he was long overdue, and a search began. Almost 100 individuals joined the search, spurred on by the fact that friends and family were offering $4 a day to any man who would assist, and there was a $1,000 reward for anyone who was able to successfully locate August. The search was particularly painstaking due to the dense and unforgiving swampland. One newspaper even reported a group of 4 men who had to crawl on their hands and knees the entire length of the Creighton Swamp. During the search, snow began to fall in the area, only adding to the difficulty. The search carried on for weeks until on December 2nd, 2 state trappers in the area began following a trail of broken twigs and branches that led them over beaver dams, swamps, and timberland until they came upon a hand protruding from a pile of snow. The hunters had found August Kleist. It quickly became clear that he had died only a couple days after getting lost, around the time it began snowing. This was evidenced by the fact that snow was found on top of, but not beneath the body. He was found only 4 miles from the Elks camp that he was so desperately searching for. While examining the body, it was discovered that all of August's clothes from the waist down had been torn away during his struggles through the underbrush. Additionally, one of his eyes had been torn completely out, presumably from running through the brush and hitting a protruding tree limb. It was surmised that August, in some kind of frenzied state, ran through the nearly impassable underbrush until he eventually succumbed to exposure and his injuries. 4 men would work in relays for hours attempting to carry the body out and back to the highway. August was taken to the town of Mastinique, where a coroner's jury decided that he died from exposure and concussion to the brain, which they assumed he had received after falling against a tree. The disappearance of August Kleist is an odd one. He was either terrible at following directions, or something was not right with his mind. Initially, this could look like a simple case of an overconfident wealthy man with minimal outdoor experience who walked into the woods wearing thin business clothes and shoes and wound up dead. There would be nothing incredible about that story. Once again, the odd part of this story comes in the state in which August's body was found. Does a man who is lost and panicked run so hard and fast through nearly impassable forest that he tears off all clothing beneath the waist and inadvertently gouges his eye out on a tree branch? It seems a little hard to believe. The pain alone should have become unbearable long before things got to the point that they did. Yet once again we find ourselves the man who seems to have set aside pain and continued on to the point most people wouldn't think possible. It seems that the coroner's jury decided that August ran in this fashion until he hit his head so hard on a tree limb that he concussed himself, at which point the cold took him. Whichever way you look at it, the disappearance and death of August Kleist is certainly unusual. 22-year-old Eddie Grant was on his first big game hunting trip with friends William McMahon and Bill Young in the Nez Perce National Forest. They had set up camp by a mountain peak called Pilot Knob. Eddie had decided to part with his companions and set out on his own in search of game. He went by car to an area called Corral Hill with intent to head east towards Baldy Mountain. Eddie's companions never heard from him again. They immediately informed family and authorities, and search parties were immediately formed under the direction of one of Eddie's brothers, Russell Grant. Close to 100 men set up a campsite from which to coordinate their efforts. Planes surveyed the ground from above while bloodhounds searched for the scent on the ground, but the only evidence that was found was that of a spent 8mm shell fired from Eddie's gun. The discovery was made about a month into the search and about 1 mile from Baldy Mountain. Foul play was considered by authorities for a time because the area where Eddie disappeared from was considered easy to walk out of. On the 39th day of the search, Eddie's body was discovered on the northwest slope of Baldy Mountain by his brothers Marvin and Milton Grant, along with Earl P. It appeared that Eddie had tripped over a tree limb and fallen to the ground where he remained, too exhausted to get up. He eventually succumbed to the elements. The searchers noticed that his rifle, chaps, hat, hunting knife, and scabbard were all missing, and that his boots had been slashed open and his feet severely wounded. It was surmised that Eddie had done this to himself in order to release pressure from his terribly swollen feet, a result of many miles of walking. This location where Eddie was found was reportedly only 2 miles from his original campsite near Pilot Knob. Eddie's cause of death was determined to be exhaustion and exposure. Eddie's body was carried off the mountain by a group of 17 men. The disappearance and death of Eddie Grant is really quite tragic. His life ended so close to the campsite he was seeking to find, and in an area that many searchers considered easy country to move around in. Planes had been searching overhead during the time Eddie was missing, but not one was able to spot him anywhere on Baldy Mountain. There was no estimate on when Eddie Grant died that I could find, but considering the search lasted 39 days, it seems safe to imagine he was sitting on the slopes of that mountain for some time. One of the more eerie aspects of this case is the way in which Eddie's boots and feet were cut and slashed. Why did he choose this method of relieving the pressure on his feet instead of simply untying the boots? It sounds like Eddie caused serious injury to his feet in this fashion, but must have continued walking nonetheless. His knife, among other items, was never found. Therefore, this self-inflicted injury must have occurred at some point earlier in his wanderings. Eddie's brothers never gave up on the search, and their perseverance paid off. They were at least able to leave this area with their brother in tow. The 3 cases discussed in this video highlight a bizarre and relatively uncommon occurrence among the missing. Each man suffered some sort of catastrophic self-mutilation during their time wandering in the forest. Is this the result of panic, or a sort of frenzied delirium where the missing don't understand what they're doing to themselves? The actions almost seem to indicate that they are not feeling the pain that they are inflicting upon themselves. Whether it be wearing the soles of your feet to the bone, crashing through thick foliage until your clothes and an eye are missing, or inflicting deep cuts on one's feet in order to relieve the pressure of a hiking boot. Most people would stop moving after receiving a fraction of some of these injuries, but these individuals kept on going until they could no longer move anymore. Each one really pushed their body to the limit of what it could endure, leaving behind a crude mystery that others can only look back on and wonder. Until next time, thanks for watching.